Welcome back to another episode of the Untethering Shame podcast. I'm your host, Kyira Wackett, and today's conversation takes us to a profound and universal question. Am I enough? For many of us, shame keeps us tethered to rigid expectations, societal norms, and the binary frameworks that tell us who we can and can't be. But what happens when we challenge those binaries? When we step outside the lines of what the world expects and embrace the fluidity of our true selves? Our guest today, Dawn Mamone, knows this journey intimately. Dawn is a queer, non-binary speaker, identity coach, and author who helps individuals and organizations foster unapologetic authenticity and create safe spaces for true self-expression. Dawn's personal story of hiding their authentic self for years and ultimately coming out to their child is a powerful reminder of the courage it takes to move from fear to pride. In this episode, we'll explore how binaries, not just gender, but also of enoughness, limit us, and how embracing fluidity can unlock a deeper sense of identity and self-worth. Together, we'll discuss what it means to trust our enoughness, how to navigate the tension between being too much and not enough, and why the freedom to live as we are is vital not only for individuals, but for society as a whole. So get ready for an inspiring conversation about rejecting shame, crossing boundaries, and celebrating the fullness of who you are. Let's dive in. Dawn, I am excited, feels like an understatement. I have been vibrating with an energy about our recording since we met. And what was that, 2 months ago at this point?
At least.
Yeah.
At least. I've been equally as excited and have been anticipating having this conversation for quite some time. So I'm glad that we're on the same page there.
Oh, me too. I like to start every episode before we kind of dive into the meat, just doing a feelings check. I think for so many of us, we are constantly going from thing to thing. So just an opportunity for us to just check in with where we're at. So I'm curious if you could describe how you're feeling right now with one word, what would it be?
Hopeful.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a very important day, socially and politically, for a variety of reasons. And I'm going to hold on to the hope for the future.
I had to explain what that word was to my daughter recently, kind of post-election and some conversations, but also I think it's a very ambiguous concept for a 4-year-old. So she's asking me what this means and how to explain it. And the more I was able to break it down, the more important that became to me. And this idea that I need to make sure that I am cultivating hope in my life also, and so much of that being perspective. I feel like for me this morning, so my daughter Everly had a situation yesterday at school where she made an assumption that somebody walked away because they were something about her being embarrassed. It was a little confusing to know all the details, but her takeaway was they walked away from me because of something that I did. And I said, oh, interesting. And we kind of dove deeper into it. And I realized that her takeaway was really a projection of rejection, embarrassment, fear, all these things coming into play, none of the details. And it was a teacher that walked away. So it wasn't another 4-year-old where that might make more sense that there was something happening, but it was a teacher that got up and it sounded like went and set up an activity. And we just had this conversation around, okay, that's one perspective. Here's a couple other. Let's just try them on and see if they change the way you feel and see if they have any likelihood that they could also be true. And as we're going through that exercise and I'm watching her begin to make these kind of shifts in her perspective, I think today especially it's giving me this, I guess the emotion would be, I don't know, maybe more I feel kind of like I'm in this shifting space. That's not an emotion, but it's I'm in this place of wanting to allow the ambiguity because sometimes I think I get so fixated on, well, I'm anxious or I'm stressed or I'm this or I'm that or this has to be done. And things just start to swirl instead of pausing and being am I able to choose a different thought to then choose a different feeling? And so I'm necessarily answering my own question, but I guess maybe in the gray a little bit, and that feels kind of exciting right now.
You've hit me with two of my favorite things, and that's language and feelings. I think language is so
Mm.
important. And our daughter's 8.5. And over the course of her life, we've been very intentional about helping her understand that language matters, that words are very important in the way that we use them, in the way that they're defined, and that they're not always as interchangeable as we allow them to be. And
Yeah.
so I think that it's really beautiful to watch another parent focus and attend to those things when a child asks you, what does that mean? Not
Mhm.
just kind of pushing it off, not kind of casting it aside and being like, oh, you'll learn later, or just kind of giving them a fluffy definition. I think it's impressive. And I love everything about that. And as you were talking, you helped invoke anticipation in me.
Mm.
That's kind of a feeling that kind of ushered forward this idea of uncertainty giving way to anticipation. Kind of felt good too.
Mhm.
So thanks for helping. I appreciate that.
Oh, I like that. When it's interesting because as I'm talking about this, I'm realizing that we're already, our focus is on this concept of binaries and sort of this either or mentality. And as I'm talking, I'm literally describing an opportunity where it was either or, either this
Yeah.
person did this or they didn't, and trying to create some of the gray for her. And so realizing, oh gosh, this is just another opportunity where this is coming up. And so I know that you and I could just do a nosedive into this topic and probably talk for 7 days straight, and minus maybe a little bit of like the laryngitis and the cough, like our
Yeah.
energy would not go anywhere. And so
No.
before we do that, can you provide some context to the listeners around this term binaries?
Yeah.
What does it mean? Why do we have these binaries? Where did they come from? And ultimately, as we think about this, how do you see them impacting the way we're living now in
Yeah.
this day and age?
The binary concept, I think, was ushered forward in humanity as something that we're kind of hardwired to do because, and it's so intricate, but to give you a global answer to a very big question, I think
Mhm.
it's simplicity.
Mm.
Life is incredibly hard. And if we all are genuinely and truly honest with ourselves and candid with ourselves, life's hard and things are big and things are complicated. And we look for ways to simplify.
Yeah.
And when I wrote my book, I talked a lot about kind of creating order out of chaos. It's how I open the
Mhm.
book and it's how I talk about it because I feel like most people feel like life is a big, hairy mess of chaos. And it's our job to make sense of that. And one of the ways in which we do that is we learn so that we can know, so that we can create systems. And then that creates in us an ability to say, okay, well, I don't have to deal with every single decision point and every single everything because now I have this system that's set up.
Mm.
Unfortunately, what happens oftentimes is we become then so rooted in that system and we resist change and adaptation and evolution and rewiring and upgrading that then our system becomes outdated.
Mhm.
And I think that's where we are right now in a variety of different ways,
Mhm.
where we exist in a place where this binary has served humanity for a period of time, whatever that binary may be, because it
Mhm.
made things easier or because we couldn't understand it to be more complex. And I love using this reference. 2001: A Space Odyssey is this beautiful scientific,
Mhm.
or excuse me, science fiction journey of a computer and a man. And there's this scene where the computer starts to take over, and the man says, "Open the pod pay doors." And it's this beautiful monotone response of, "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that." And it like strikes fear into the heart of everyone because the system is designed to protect the system and to defend the system. So
Mhm.
the slightly long-winded answer, Kyira, is that I think that we believed for a period of time that we needed them, and maybe for a very short period of time we did. And once we decide we need them, we are so reluctant and so afraid to let go of them that we find ourselves where we are now, which is with an outdated, short-sighted binary that we just continue to operate in.
Mm. Well, and it makes me think about whenever I would teach or do workshops on fear. That's a lot of the conversation around fear, which is fear is there to protect you, just like you're describing. The system is designed to protect the system. Like our
Hmm.
fear response system is designed to keep us safe. And
Right.
if we're thinking, I played the Oregon Trail growing up, like you don't
Yeah.
want to eat the thing, you don't want to get the dysentery. Like there's a yes or no, good or bad. You're either going to die or live. And these are the things that you do. And so the systems really were designed to create yes or no and to provide some order when really survival was the key goal.
Right.
And as you think about sort of all the opportunities we have now, my biggest example, if you've ever gone to Cheesecake Factory, is their menu is like 17,000 menu options.
Yep.
And it is such an overwhelming experience. And the brain basically is like, duh, like, I don't know what to do with this. And I'm going to sit here for 6 hours to go over
Yeah.
every decision. And it's this idea that that system, the fear response system, was designed to keep us safe.
Hmm.
This is good. This is bad. This is safe. This is not. This is healthy. This is unhealthy. And then we continued using that system because it worked at the
Yeah.
times we needed it. But now we're in such an ambiguous state with so much, an abundance of opportunity and choice. And I
Yep.
think that's really overwhelming. And so there has to be a right or wrong. It has to be you either go to college or you're not motivated and ambitious. You
Right.
either are this person or you're not, you're lazy, you're gross. You're either this or
Hmm.
that. And we really try to focus on the content of just this very specific idea versus the context of an experience or a person. And I think it goes back to what you just said of the system is designed to protect the system. Because we haven't done the work individually and collectively to really learn about how to wire our brain to be more okay in the ambiguity, we've just relied on, I don't know, like MS-DOS basically, but it's 2024 and we're on like the most, I have no idea what computer language we're in now,
Right.
but we're not upgrading to that yet. And so then it puts us in this weird place of like, wait a minute, but like I probably should know the answer to this and I should have this and it should be this easy. And if I can't make it this easy, then I'm overwhelmed and anxious and I don't know what to do with that. So we're just going to default back to it has to then be that. I am just going to pick one, yes or no, and that's going to be it.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about the fear you just mentioned and the way in which you so perfectly described it is I think that humanity's biggest fear is externalized now based
Mhm.
on societal pressure.
Yeah.
And it is the ambiguity, which again, I 100% agree with you on that. There's this feeling of like, well, if I don't know for sure, then I'm not going to even kind of venture into that place. It's like, I see standing water and I don't know how deep it is. So I'm just going to stay over here on the shore. Like, there's no chance.
Yes.
But even more than that, there's this fear of, okay, well, I want to go out into this water and I think I can swim and I don't think it's that deep and I think I can traverse it and I think there's beauty on the other side. And then you look at all the other people on the shore and your
Mhm.
immediate thought is, but that one's going to point at me and laugh. And that one's going to say
Yes.
I'm crazy. And that one's going to tell my mom and then I'm going to get in trouble. Like the externalized pressure that we feel is considerable. And
Mhm.
that is clearly so much of my journey and the journey of anybody who exists in a gender nonconforming space is we have to get past that fear first. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the fear of acknowledging who you are. It's the fear, guilt, shame, doubt, and all the stuff from society. And then it's taking that bold leap to say, all of that aside, I get to be exactly who I am everywhere I go, no matter who I'm with. And that's going to require me to realize that other people's opinions of me don't matter.
Mhm.
I don't have to say, boy assigned at birth, boys don't have long hair, boys don't paint their nails, boys don't wear these clothes. I have to be able to say, maybe that's the way it used to be. Maybe that's the
Mhm.
way that you're comfortable, but it's not my job to make you comfortable. I'm going to go do what I want. And
Right.
it's breaking free of that fear. That is not an easy thing for anyone to do. It's a big
Mhm.
leap.
Yeah, and you really did just kind of take us. I mean, that's kind of what we did. We took it from the broad all the way down to the shame component, which is that at our core, we need connection and belonging.
Hmm.
And if the fear is ultimately that is the thing at risk, we're not going to do that because we can't chance rejection and
Right.
isolation. And so we can see it, we can believe it. I think for so many people, if we're talking about their identity and the binaries around identity, that's that sort of tumultuous inner turmoil, which is,
Hmm.
but this doesn't fit, but I have to keep pretending and I have to do this because I have to fit in. And what are people going to think? And likely, you've had potentially direct, more often indirect experiences of watching that rejection and isolation,
Yep.
some flippant comment about somebody that, is biologically male or assigned male at birth. And then they are, I'm trying to think of some of the words like fruity. That was a big word that I would hear uncles use when I was
Yep.
growing up. Oh,
Yep.
that's a very fruity little boy. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, whoo, okay, so that's bad. I can't do that. So you start to internalize these things, and then it becomes your brain's idea of, well, that's absolutely going to happen to me. So
Mm-hmm.
then it isn't, I might get in the water and no one's going to point at me and laugh. I
Yeah.
actually might inspire someone else to get in the water. It's, I have to bank on, and now it's a binary that we create for ourselves, an all or nothing. I'm going to assume without a doubt, yes, people
Mm-hmm.
are going to reject me, so I can't do it. And then I think sometimes the pain and the pressure is feeling like, so the only way I could be okay is if I stop caring what anybody thinks. And that's also not true.
Right.
You can still care what people think. It's just being maybe a little bit more inclusive of our own thoughts about ourselves, and then also maybe a bit more mindful of who we're giving leeway to. Like my sort of inner compass is, if I don't like you enough that I would pay to take you out to lunch, why
Mm-hmm.
am I giving you my much more coveted resources, which is my time or energy, to give
Yeah.
a shit what you think about me? It doesn't mean I can always let go of it, but
Yeah.
to me, I can start to be like, wait a minute, you don't actually rank that high for me, and yet I'm giving you this much power. What would
Mm-hmm.
it be like if I looked at creating and cultivating resources where I felt like I would buy that person lunch? I do feel safe with that person. Gosh, maybe I am afraid that everyone else is going to reject me. And I've created a space where it's not, I'm going to be universally rejected. It is, I'll feel rejection and I'll still be okay.
And that is the payoff. You've unpacked so many things for me. When we're really young and super impressionable and we don't have a voice or a choice, those are the foundational times when something is instilled in us without
Mm-hmm.
our sort of buy-in, without us saying, okay, yeah, I'm on board with that. And it oftentimes takes it oftentimes takes place when somebody that we look to for that belonging and acceptance and community and approval speaks near us or even to us without realizing they're talking about us. And so
Mm.
that played itself out in my childhood. I can't even tell you how many times. The number of times I heard or saw things like, well, don't let your kid turn out to be a sissy, or don't let your child be too girly, or, boys that have long hair are unkept and hippies, or whatever negative term, I heard it all the time. And genuinely, there was not any opportunity to have positive representation for a gender nonconforming person in my childhood, except for the rock stars that I couldn't really identify with because I wasn't a
Yeah.
rock star. I was
Right.
just some cute little kid who was looking for someone that could represent me. And so each and every time I would have someone near me or actually to me talking about me in this negative and derogatory way, it
Mm-hmm.
just pushed me further away from the potential of choosing authenticity. And I was coaching somebody years ago, Kyira, and I first called it the fallout. And I kind of coined this term in my coaching practice where I would tell the person, like, you are experiencing what I call the fear of the fallout. And it is this
Mm.
belief in you that the potential negative consequences of your authentic choice are not potential, they're certain. And they're not just some like inconvenience, they're catastrophic,
Mm-hmm.
collateral, massive damage. And I called it fallout, thinking of radioactive bolt from the blue type fallout.
Yeah.
And so what do? Is you go into a shelter, you close the door, and you protect yourself at all cost.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where a lot of people find themselves in the hardest binary decision that they would ever make. And that's, do I choose authenticity or do I choose conformity? And when we're young, when we're weak, when we are in need of guidance and compassion and community the most, we typically will choose conformity 10 times out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
And we spend the rest of our lives seeking authenticity. And some of us achieve it in small parts, some of us achieve it much more wildly. Sometimes the fallout is massive, and sometimes the fallout is not so massive. But ultimately, it's my belief, my genuine belief, and my experience time and time again when I've had the pleasure of helping people. The windfall, as I call it, always outweighs the fallout. It's not always
Mm-hmm.
pretty and it's not always easy, but there is a life on the other side of that deep water we were just kind of talking about as an
Mm-hmm.
analogy that is a beautiful, unseen land by you, in which you get to live as exactly who you are and in exactly the way you want, making those decisions that are now infinite instead of just this or that.
Yeah. When I think as you were talking about that, it brought up this idea of, I think sometimes we confuse being alone versus lonely. And so for a lot of people, I think the fears, the projections, the fallout might come with being alone. You
Mm-hmm.
might be alone for a while, but I think sometimes it's bringing some awareness, but to the fact that loneliness is the worst experience. It
Yeah.
is the most harmful experience. And what you're feeling now, even though you're not alone and you're surrounded by all these people, is loneliness. And
Yeah.
that disconnect has a much greater effect on our social emotional well being, on our physical health. And so it's really starting to shift the buy in from you're lonely now.
Mm-hmm.
You, when you turn towards yourself authentically, you don't experience loneliness in the same way. You can still experience it. It's not
Sure.
a you have it or you don't. Everyone has it at different periods, regardless of how they're living. But the depth is much different. And I think that is, it sounds like something that you really work on when you think about the fallout and the windfall. But I'm curious because you also started to allude to, you grew up with, I love the way, I don't love the experience for you, but I love the way that you just articulated that, of people talking near you or to you about you without an awareness that they were talking about you. And I think
Yeah.
that happens for so many of us, and it becomes really difficult to own that and to talk about it, because then we feel like we're villainizing our parents or we're villainizing these people. Or if we were the people that did it, then we're a problem. And we have all these defenses that come up.
Yeah.
And it's realizing, I mean, I probably do this all the time. I've done it to my kid, I'm sure, at some point. I've done it to my clients at some point. I am speaking from my own internalized bias and collective experiences that I work really hard to undo some of the things that I know aren't helpful. And I'm also still going to be viewing the world through a skewed lens based on my experiences and the absorbed experiences of others. And so I think sometimes, I guess I have two questions for you. They don't even really go together, but we'll start. The first one is, how do you feel when you think about that? Like when you think about people that did that for you? Because my guess is part of your authenticity journey had to do with releasing maybe anger, sadness, resentment, pain towards some of those people.
Mm-hmm.
And then my second question is, given that that's how you're describing growing up, what were some of those binaries that then you felt like you had to make a choice and do some of those hiding, kind of hiding the self, performing aspects? And at what point in your life did you decide, I don't want to do that anymore?
Yeah, those are really insightful questions. When we talk about what I grew up in or who I grew up with, I gave the family around me a lot of credit. My family was conventional but not conservative. They really did believe in like equality for all. They believed in civil rights, gay rights, like everything. Gender rights weren't really an issue in mainstream society when I
Mm-hmm.
was young. They were being fought on the streets of New York, which I was painfully unaware of in the southern southwest of the United States. But they really weren't a thing that we were acknowledging. But in every other way, I saw a lot of sort of egalitarian, open-minded, open-hearted things. It was really interesting that I grew up in a family, though, that had sort of gender expression expectations, is the
Mm-hmm.
way that I would describe it. And that was the way in which I most often felt that feeling of like around me or to me, about me, because boys didn't have long hair. Like
Mm-hmm.
I didn't literally have hair past the collar of my shirt until I grew it out to affirm my gender identity in my 40s,
Yeah.
because I was so rooted in the idea that boys don't have long hair. And I think that there is a considerable amount of freedom and innocence around being able to say, listen, you were doing the best you could with what you had. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't intentional. I think in my family, it wasn't malicious. Now, that it isn't true in all families,
Right.
but the impact was still very similar.
Mm-hmm.
The binaries that I got stuck in were really and truly that brick wall iron curtain that exists between pink and blue in our society. And the way that I describe it in the book is, it was 1980 something, and I was in my aunt's basement, and it was always comfortable and felt right to me to play with and act in ways that were both on the masculine and the feminine side of what was expected of children.
Mm-hmm.
We played dress up, and I like to dress up in this. I describe it in the book as my skirt. Like I had this skirt, I would put it on, we would drink tea, we would play, we would do these things. And it wasn't so much something that I liked to do. It's that I liked how it made me feel. It felt right to me, which again is another binary, right and wrong. It felt good to me. It was affirming to me.
Yeah, it was authentic to you and your expression.
Right. And unfortunately, though, I very quickly learned that boys don't wear skirts. And the sort of innocence of childhood, playing with whatever I wanted to play with and wear whatever I wanted to wear, quickly gave way to that was okay in the basement when you were 5, but now that you're at 7 and you're in school, you will behave in this way. And for fear of the fallout, the rest of my life until my early 40s was, this is the box that you get to exist in the system that has been constructed. This is your container. And I squeezed myself very uncomfortably into a container in which I never fit. And to answer your question, and it's one of my favorite stories, and it's the most beautiful question, was I had been married to Emily for 7 years. We had a 9-month-old baby. And from the minute of her birth until around 9 months, I started to feel different. I started to feel anxious, and I started to sleep less. And originally, Kyira, it was, well, you're keeping a tiny human alive. Like, this is just the pangs and arrows of parenthood.
Right.
But then I noticed that my anxiety was increasing. I experienced my first panic attacks. And it wasn't until I really sat in a place of vulnerability and true candor with myself that this was the crescendo. It was the watershed moment of, if I continue to live this manufactured existence, I will pass this sort of belief system onto a precious little gift that I want to tell that I will never, ever love her any less for who she is. And you know how it is with kids. You got a 4-year-old. If you tell them one thing and then do another, they're automatically going to either do what you do or call you out on the hypocrisy. And there was this overwhelming feeling of dread that I would be somehow shoehorning my daughter into a box in society that she did not fit in, that didn't fit her, and that would make her uncomfortable. And the only way for me to ensure that that didn't happen was to finally stand up and say, this is me. The journey from my 41-year-old self, who finally said, I don't know who I am. Genuinely, I have no idea who I am or what it means, but I'm not willing to not be that anymore. It took 4.5 years until I finally kind of was really rooted in the fact that my gender identity is non-binary or gender fluid or gender queer, or however you want to, like that. Those are labels that identify who I am in my essence, and that I'm going to live it unapologetically, and that I'm going to write books about it, and I'm going to speak about this tightrope between not enough and too much, and how people get to just live in a world where they just get to be instead of do. It was a hard pass for me. That was, somebody asked me the most interesting question, Kyira, to segment or to segue into your next question is, they said, do you think if you didn't have children, you would have ever acknowledged your identity? And the answer is probably no.
Yeah.
There was nothing in my life, to include marrying my wife, who I loved a lot. And we've had a wonderful relationship. We've been married for 15 years, together for 17. I never told her. I never told my sister. I never told my grandparents. I never told anybody I ever got truly and genuinely close with, until I knew the impact it would have on the one person who I felt solely responsible to raise in a society that is far too judgmental. So I think the answer to that question is probably no, I wouldn't have. And so my dedication in the book is to a number of people, but the one to Frankie just says, for being my reason why.
I love that. I wrote down, was the child your invitation? And I think about that of like, children are, for many of us, sometimes a very forced invitation, because we would really like to put the ignorance veil back on, but it's not there. And that's really hard. And I think it is that my assumption, so tell me, because I don't want to be putting words to your story that don't fit, but my assumption is as you got older and you felt deep and true love with your
Mm-hmm.
partner, with other people, there was this aspect of you that didn't feel like you were fully authentically you, but you had these things that felt so good. It could exist in the background. You were aware it was there, but you could be okay. You're like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm okay like this. I feel good and I have these things that are really important. And then as soon as Frankie is born, it's, oh, but I'm not okay if she has this because
Right.
my job is to protect her. And
Yep.
I know I'm okay,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know the effect it's going to have on her. And I don't know what that's going to be like. And I don't ever want her. And then you start to go back to these moments from your childhood where you remember feeling like you were a problem
Yep.
and that you had to hide it. And you go, oh, I'm not as okay as I thought I was. This
Mm-hmm.
wasn't okay.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to be okay, not only for her, but now for me. And that's my assumption, what that 4.5 year journey was, is then getting to a place of enough buy-in to say, and I have the right and the willingness to now say something about it and do something different about it. Because the way, and I know we talked about more of this before we recorded, but just the way you've described your marriage and your partnership, my assumption is probably the fear came in and tried to invite you to be like, well, what's she going to think? What's going to
Mm-hmm.
happen? But on some level, there was a rooting there, a safety on some level
Yeah.
that it really, my guess is it had a lot to do with you just sort of releasing and letting go of that and making that choice of, I deserve to, I'm allowed to, and I'm willing to raise my voice up and say this.
Mm-hmm.
Because now it isn't just, I'm going to change the way that I raise my daughter. It's, I'm going to change the way that I love myself. And that's that
Mm-hmm.
piece where you're like, they're going to call bullshit because it can't just be as simple as, do what I say, not as I do, or whatever that sort of adage is. But it's, I want her to witness bravery with
Mm-hmm.
somebody making that choice. And what a beautiful opportunity, because she could have, partner could have, other people could have rejected you. And you got to give her that opportunity. And that's a really cool invitation. And then it's an invitation for you to say, what would I do if that happened? And can I show her that loving me means I can't ultimately let, even if it's her feelings about me, stop me from making that choice. And that, as a parent, is the best gift I could give my daughter, even if that means I got hurt in the
Yep.
process.
Yeah. I mean, you summarized it so beautifully. I describe having a conversation with Emily at that 9-month window as letting someone in. I struggled so
Mm.
hard, Kira, because when I was writing the book, I wanted to write it in somewhat chronological order. And so I take you through childhood a little bit. And then there's a point at which I was like, well, I want to talk about how Emily was the first person I ever told. And so I was like, I had this kind of feeling that, oh, this is my coming out story. And but it didn't fit chronologically because there was this period of time after I let Emily in. And when I finally told the world of
Yeah.
figuring out who I am, and I'm like, how could I figure out who I am after I come out? And it doesn't make any sense. And so I realized that on that day when I shared it with Emily, I let her into my shelter and I shut the door behind
Mhm.
us. And for a very long time, she shouldered the burden of this secret, and it didn't feel like a secret. Like the way you described it is so perfect. I was basically so used to wearing the uncomfortable mask and costume that it
Mhm.
wasn't even really that uncomfortable anymore.
Yeah.
And so, let sleeping dogs lie. Why ruffle feathers? It, just get along to get along, give along to get along,
Mhm.
whatever it is. Like, it felt okay.
Yeah.
But I had blocked out all the years of sort of turmoil and upset and struggle to get to that place of it just existing in okay. And so when I let Emily in, the other so beautiful thing is Frankie was not only my reason why, but she really is genuinely the first person who ever got to meet me and never know the old me.
Mm. Yeah.
So like at 9 months and, shortly after that, the world shut down because of this whole ugly thing called a global pandemic. And so my sister, my wife and my daughter and I pretty much existed in this house for the most part as I figured the F out who I am.
Yeah.
And it's just been a really amazing journey because my daughter will look at older pictures of me, or she'll ask old stories about me, or she'll see a wedding photo of me and my wife, and she'll be like, "Who is that?" And then she'll look closer and she'll be like, "Is that you, Daddy?" And I was like, "Yes, that is me." And she's like, "I like you so much more now," as if the picture talks to her. Like, it's just a picture of me.
Yeah.
And one of the most beautiful stories, Kyira, is she looked at one of our wedding photos and she goes, "What's the matter with your face?" And I was like, well, Daddy had a lot of scrub. Like, no, like your smile, it's different.
Mm.
And I realized that my smile was very different. I never liked pictures. I wasn't a big fan of taking pictures as the subject. I like to take pictures as the photographer. And the reason was because seeing a picture of me was just a reminder of the inauthenticity and the veneer and the manufactured version of me that I showed the world. And so I had this weird way of smiling without kind of showing my teeth, and it was more of a grin. And when you look at pictures of me now, it is a completely different smile, and it takes the innocence of a child who wasn't there for that to look at it and point that out. And that is the anecdote that I can say so beautifully describes what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
It was a gift that I was able to give my daughter that there would have been no other way to give it to her. But what I didn't realize at the time was all of those things that I was worried about. Chief among them, ironically, that you also so intuitively pointed out, was my job in life was to make Emily and Frankie's job and life easier.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say I protect them because they're totally capable, big, strong women doing what they do, but I wanted to insulate them, right? I wanted to make things easier, help facilitate, whatever it is. Me being who I am had this shadow of it's going to make their life harder.
Yeah.
They're going to be alienated, ostracized, villainized. And the beauty is that when I look at it now, I have also instilled in my daughter an unbelievable strength. My 8.5-year-old has already told people, yeah, that's my daddy. And they're both boy and girl because they're non-binary and they're the best daddy in the world. And so there she is advocating for a lack of binary, a lack of either or, and realizes that there's not only a great deal of power and confidence and courage that comes along with authenticity, but in also sort of representation, showing people that you're good with it, you're excited about it, that it's a part of your life. And so, yeah, my wife told me that ever since I came out and figured out who I was and live authentically, I'm a better everything, because she's watched me just open up and accept who I am and use that in so many beautiful ways. And when my wife talks, I listen. So I'll never forget that.
Well, it's interesting because you think about, gosh, on the back end, like when your computer's open and I'm notorious for, I have in any given day, 20 plus tabs open on my computer.
Yeah.
The only time they get closed is when I'm recording. And so
Right.
it's like, but wait, what about this? And I have this Facebook Marketplace ad that I may or may not want this thing that's on sale, but I'm also looking at this thing and I'm halfway through this article. And if you think about all of the energy your computer's using on the back end for these things,
Yeah.
that's what you were doing. It was all of this energy to suppress and repress.
Yep.
Repress the painful moments of your backstory and what you had experienced, and then suppress your authentic self for the rest of the world's interpretation and experience of you. And so that was using so much energy that now that that's freed up, you can put that towards things that matter. And it's so interesting to think about that because I think, growing up in the Midwest, I now know that I'm half Iranian. I didn't know who my father was growing up. My mom got pregnant, lots of different stories that never really lined up. So I knew her side of the family, which was, Norwegian, German, very white Midwesterners. And as I'm like kind of figuring out this part of my identity, like I think about all of these ways where growing up, again, think Midwest, intergenerational transmission of norms and binaries, lack of emotional awareness, maybe we'll say, intelligence, expression, everything was that. This is what's right. This is what's wrong. And a lot of it felt like it was, we have to control the narrative. And I feel
Yes.
like that's so much of how the binaries come into play is to control the narrative. Like I even think about the election and I was talking to a friend that was like, But I actually, like, they voted for Harris, but they also very openly say that they actually feel like they support Trump and Trump's plan on a few different things, but they don't talk about it with
Mm.
anyone around them because they would be villainized and immediately pushed into a different category. And the conversation that we had was, when did it become so unsafe for there to be a gray area? Like, now, again, I mean, this is the parent invitation of the stuff you don't always want to have to deal with. But as my daughter's like, is God real? What's the right religion? Does this
Yeah.
happen? Are spirits real? What happens when you die? And I feel like the two most powerful things I can do is to, one, say, I don't know, and
Mm-hmm.
just allow that to be a powerful statement. Baby, I don't know. I know
Mm-hmm.
that there are things that are bigger than me, and I know that most things we think are true often evolve. At one point, butter was bad. Now it's good. At one point,
Yeah.
apples were good. Now we're not so sure. Like, everything seems to just ebb and flow. I'm just going to go with, I don't know, but let's explore.
Yeah.
And then to instill in her to ask the question, why? And I think when we were growing up, it wasn't, at least for me, I didn't live in a household or have family, an extended kind of community where kids asking why was celebrated. It
Mm-mm.
was punished. And
Yeah.
so it couldn't be, well, why can't boys have long hair? Why is that bad? What's
Yeah.
the threat? What what is the fear there? Or why can't X, Y, and Z? And all of these different pieces. And even thinking about, I mean, a lot of the internalized bias against the Middle East that my family gave me. And then I find out that I'm Middle Eastern and I'm like, how do I deal with that? Because I'm sure
Right.
I've got some internalized bias there. And it's like all these different things where it's like, I think we're so, if we go back to what you said in the beginning around the system protects the system,
Mm-hmm.
we've created this false sense of control. We try to control everything that is really ultimately out of our control. What other
Yep.
people think, global disasters, all these different things. We try to control all of this stuff and in turn let go of the things we can control, which is that connection to self,
Right.
our beliefs, the way that we show up and live in the world, what we say, what we hold on to, how we view the world is in our control. We do have the capacity to change that, to evolve in
Mm-hmm.
that. But it is going back to all of this, the fear of, well, what does that mean? And I think for me, I've learned a lot of it is as an individual and as a society, it's learning to grieve the expectations that we had of ourselves. If you're a parent, the
Mm-hmm.
expectation of you had of your kid. Because you said
Mm-hmm.
something around it would be harder for Emily and for your daughter.
Yeah.
And so then it's grieving. You had this idea of what your family life would be like. And now this thing happened that you think is not happened. You're sharing this part of yourself that feels like an inconvenience and it's going to make something harder. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of parents do that unintentionally and kind of reinforce binaries to not make their kids' life harder. Gosh, it
Yeah.
would be harder for them if
Right.
they didn't just fit in the binary. And it's the grieving of an expectation, the grieving of control, and the awareness that there's a shitty feeling on both sides. But again, if we go back to alone versus lonely, I would, for so much, all the money and the energy in the world, rather feel alone than the loneliness that I have felt when I do silence my authentic voice to fit into any binary that I've
Yeah.
ever tried to force myself into or felt like I had to adhere to be accepted in the world.
And I don't. So I think it's worth noting that I don't think being on one side of a spectrum is inherently a bad thing. And
No.
if we just stay with gender, because that's kind of my zone of expertise at this
Mm-hmm.
point, if you are a rock solid cisgender woman or a rock solid cisgender man and you
Yes.
are kind of at the polar ends, that's amazing for you. I live in a place where there are plots on a graph, not sides of a line.
Yeah.
And I think that's beautiful. And, it's one of the zeitgeist right now is Wicked. And I don't know if you're familiar with Wicked, and it's social instead of political. And I think it's really interesting because I posted recently that living in a world that is celebrating Wicked at the sort of fever pitch that we are right now, and yet we are trampling on trans and gender nonconforming people's rights at the same time seems incongruent. It seems almost like irony is dead. That these two concepts are existing in the same place at other ends of acceptance. And one of the beautiful things that comes from that you just pointed out is, number one, being willing to say, I don't know. Also, just living in a place where if this person is this thing is not inherently good or bad.
Yes.
Right. And that's one of the main themes, right? If this is a good witch and this is a bad witch, this is what a good witch looks like. This is what a bad witch looks like. Like that type of compartmentalizing and labeling from outside of a person is part of what puts us in places where we become intolerant and divisive. And so when someone listens to the rhetoric in society or in politics and sees me coming down the street and looks at me and says, there's one of those people.
Yes.
That is part of the problem.
Yes.
And the same is true if I'm walking across a park and I see someone with a red hat on. This says Make America Great Again. I certainly have emotional feelings towards that when it comes to, again, the political landscape. But ultimately, what I remind myself is the person in that hat is just that, a human, a person. And just because they have a red hat on doesn't make them a bad person, much like having green skin doesn't make you a bad witch. And so I love when, well, I have this love-hate relationship when society creates entertainment and or an act of culture that can so beautifully reflect something that we're struggling with. I love that. And I hate that not everybody sees it. Not everybody can dig deep enough. A lot of people stay at the surface and are just like, what a great movie. So I think that's just, it's a truly beautiful thing to acknowledge that the one thing we all have in common is humanity. And ironically, the one thing that, like you said, isn't always rewarded, but is oftentimes punished is that we are all different.
Yeah.
Right or wrong, up or down, good or bad, we are all different. And so that's something that genuinely gets to be celebrated. And lastly, I'd like to point out how beautiful it was that you said like a parent's intention sometimes for doing what they did, and how I sort of gave my family credit where credit was due. They want to insulate and protect their children. They want to create an easy life for their children. And that's because in society, we believe that the nail that sticks up, what happens to it, right? It gets hammered down. And one of the things that came to me as I was writing, and I'm so very proud of it, is I think that what people don't realize is the things that make them different are not their kryptonite. The things that make them different are their superpowers. The things that make them different are what allow them to put on a red cape and stand in front of and sometimes above others and be like, I'm out here for you. I will protect and defend you, and you too can rise up with me. And the reason that's the case is because hammers don't work on superheroes. So if you acknowledge that what makes you different is your superpower, not your kryptonite, then people can hammer at you all day long. It doesn't mean you won't feel it, but it means it won't destroy you. It won't make you crumble. And so I, of course, in my space in the world is I'm an advocate for more nails standing up and less worry about whether or not you're going to be hammered down.
I love this. And I think two of the things that you just brought up, I really appreciate you calling out the idea that if people are on, like, identify as being on a far end of a spectrum, that's also not bad. This came up in a recent conversation. I had an episode with, his name's Simon, and we talked about men's mental health. And one of the things that came up at the end of the episode is now identifying as a cisgender white male, there's such a story now there that it is, he has internalized this idea of then that's now bad and he's always the problem, or he has to like buy into a very specific way. And I think sometimes we overcorrect in our response. And I think a lot of that comes from our internalized shame and guilt, that then we don't also make space that, no, we're also not saying now that the ends don't exist. We're just saying broaden the perspective. And so I really appreciate that you pointed that out, because I think most times I think it's an unintentional dismissal but it's still painful. Like, again, if we think about impact, even though the intention might not be malicious. And so I think that's important. And one of the things that really came up then is when I was reading The Body Is Not an Apology, Sonia Renee Taylor talks about body love and radical self-love. And one of the big things she talked about in there was this idea of social ladders of comparison.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about this. I read the book early in the pandemic. So I was a very new mom. And I had a lot of stories about having to be perfect, which has been a problem my whole life, but
Yeah.
particularly with my own trauma with my mom, with this pressure to be everything for my daughter. I think a lot of these ideas about how I had to be, and the social ladder of comparison was around, fuck, at least I'm not that mom. Gosh, I'm
Yeah.
better than this one because I didn't do this.
Yeah.
Or I'll never be her. Gosh, she's amazing. Look at that. She does all this stuff. And it's this idea that really binaries are a perpetuation of a ladder system, that the only way to be okay is to be able to climb over and to keep climbing against other people.
Right.
And we put certain people at the top based on content, not context. And so I
Yeah.
think what you said when you're like, a human is a human, you
Mm-hmm.
basically alluded to this depth that I think it's easier to forget. Like, what's
Yeah.
more exciting when you're standing in line and you're going to read a magazine that's like, learn all about the depth of someone's story and why they are this way, or the like news article pop, pop, pop gets your attention because so-and-so is cheating and they did it with this person in this house
Yeah.
doing these things. And so we stick to these sort of horizontal, exciting ideas. And I think the content driven and the ladder driven ways of viewing the world hooks us because it does that instead of going, well, what if I stopped? And I had this with a friend recently where I found out that we voted very different politically and we had very different beliefs on a couple key values for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I immediately felt that like, oh my gosh, everything's changing. I don't know how I feel. And then I stopped and I was like, what are you doing? Like, knock it off. You can have your moment. Like, feel that way.
Yeah.
That's okay. You feel like you
Yep.
have to protect yourself. There's
Yep.
something in that. I get it. Now go be curious. And the
Yeah.
choice to be curious rather than judgmental was the choice to get off the ladder and to say, what if instead of standing above you or below you, I stood next to you and I understood your root system? And
Mm-hmm.
that was it was probably the best conversation I've ever had around politics and around sort of social norms and identity and choices ever in my life. And the two of us left with such a greater sense of respect for each other. I would say this
Mm-hmm.
is now like the safest person for me to think about talking about any of my feelings around the election and where we're going. And it's like all from the choice, one, of not shaming myself, of noticing I had judgment. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a key thing of like, we're all going to have that. We're all going to
Yep.
have little reactions of, oh, this isn't supposed to be this way. People are supposed to act this way. This is the binary, get in line, noticing it, and then coming out from a place of curiosity. And the beauty of that is I also felt safer to articulate myself authentically around what I believe and not having to be like, well, I'm just this and I vote for this, but instead going, and this is where I'm not in agreement with some of these things. And I don't know how to make sense of it. And I don't know what to do. And it was lovely because we left solving nothing,
Mm-hmm.
but feeling more seen. And that ultimately feels like the goal that we all have is that.
Yes, I think that we all get to be seen. And amongst us all, I think one of our biggest desires is to be the author of our own story, which means that we get
Mhm.
to tell the world who we are and how we get to be seen, not who they
Yes.
think we are and how they get to see us, right? From internal to external, not the other way around. You have pointed out so many beautiful things. The latter concept, having gone from being a cis presenting straight white male
hmm
to a non-binary or gender non-conforming straight white male, I say that I sacrificed and or willingly handed over a significant amount of privilege.
Yeah.
And I genuinely believe that the price of authenticity is oftentimes privilege. You will always, I think, pay a certain amount of privilege if you're authentic.
So true.
Now, when I speak of a ladder, and this, I had this question asked of me by a Black American in my audience because I was talking about privilege from gender perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I explained that. And the question that was so beautifully asked was, I'm one of maybe 3 or 4 Black Americans in this room. If this room were full of Black Americans, would you ask me the same? Would you say this the same way? Like, would you
Wow.
have the same position? And I had to think on the fly. And I'm quite proud, to be perfectly candid, of my response. And I do genuinely believe that society doesn't have to be a ladder.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to crawl over other people to ascend or descend social status or whatever else.
Yes.
I do very much believe that privilege exists on a ladder, and that perched upon the top of that ladder is the straight, white, cis male,
Mm-hmm.
followed in rank and order based on what people value from a privilege perspective.
Yeah.
What about them makes their existence more or less difficult? About their core identity, not their money, not their things,
Yes.
maybe how they got money, maybe their generational wealth, all of those things. And so it's much like the ends of the spectrum. Nobody gets to feel bad, and we're not trying to reduce the validity of the ends of the spectrum, just like we're not trying to reduce the validity of someone's privilege.
Right.
It's just an acknowledgement changes everything. If someone sits at the top of the privilege ladder and refuses to acknowledge that their life will never be harder because of their gender, their sex, or their race, we have a bit of a challenge and an opportunity. Whereas when they say being straight, white, and cis, sitting on top of this ladder, I have considerable advantage because none of those things are ever going to be used against me, is a beautiful place. And that's when conversation and language can mean so much. And I think it's fun because as we get ready to wrap, I'm sure we are going to go back to where we started.
Exactly.
And that's with this concept of feelings. I want the audience to know something. I think what you have expressed based on the conversation that you had started with language, but it probably really rooted itself in you because of how you felt.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is you can't think your way out of a feeling.
Right.
I've experienced this countless times when the voices in my head, the mean ones, the doubtful ones, the society-driven ones that say you're not allowed to like this person, you can't have a conversation with this person, you're stupid, you're ugly, you're going to make your life harder. When I started to feel what authenticity felt like, when I started to feel how proud I was that my daughter was going to live authentically, when I was proud of being who I was for my wife and with my wife, none of the words matter because you can't think your way out of that feeling. It will take root, it will take hold, and that's what we continue. And then for those of you who are listening right now that struggle in any way with shame, guilt, fear, doubt, self-limiting beliefs, imposter syndrome, one of the things that you get to do is you get to treat yourself with the same kindness that you would externalize, right? If we said to the people in our lives what we say about and to ourselves in our head, we would get punched in the face much more frequently.
Yes.
Like, I can't imagine the number of people that have said to me after I take their picture, oh my God, why do I look so fat? I was like, would you say that to the person standing behind you? No. Well then, and the last thing is, we live in a world of should and supposed to and need to. I have replaced all those things, Kyira, with get to. When you start accepting that you get to be kind to yourself, that you get to be who you are, that you get to decide that everything in the world is neutral, it happens, it doesn't automatically mean it's good or bad. The world just has a different way of showing up for you. And you replace fragility, which means, am I doing the right thing? Am I allowed to do this? Am I supposed to do this? Should I do this? Should I do that? With freedom. I get to do and I get to be who I want, where I want, when I want, with anybody I want. And that freedom really changes things. And so I think that's part of what that conversation was that you had with your friend. And I think it's absolutely game changing, life changing and game changing.
I love this. And you did my job for me. You wrapped us back up to the beginning. You answered my next question, which is going to be, what do you want to invite them? I mean, I'm not needed anymore. It's what's
You
happening.
are so needed. It's not my first rodeo, but you are so needed.
I am so grateful for this conversation. I feel like, I try really hard when I come into something of just, and this is, I guess, me bringing it back full circle when you talked about hopeful and anticipation. It's the anticipation and then the willingness to just let go of control. It's why I don't plan the questions. It's why I just want it to be that, is like just trusting that we're going to be able to do something here that feels powerful and feels like an invitation to both of us to keep doing the work that we're doing and the digging and the reflecting, and then to give that to listeners as an invitation to say, gosh, you don't have to do this. You get to use your words, you get to say
Mm-hmm.
no. If you don't want to
Yep.
listen to this, turn it off. You get to say, no, I don't want to make a change. I'm okay. I don't want to do anything different. You get to. That's that radical ownership piece, that radical authorship piece. We're not telling you what to do. You just get to
Mm-mm.
decide if this fits for you and what you want to do with that. But you did allude to a couple things. And so, one, I need you to make sure everybody knows about your book because this is newly released.
Newly
And
released.
I mean, I just feel like everybody's going to be rushing to look for that. I also want people to know because you work with people individually. And so, can you tell them first about your book and where they can find it? And second, if someone's like, oh my gosh, I need more Dawn, I need to talk to them about where I'm at with some of these pieces and sort this out or got the fallout. Like that is my takeaway, is that's my stopping point. How would they reach out to you to do some one-on-one work as well?
Thank you for asking. I am so immensely proud of the book that I ushered into the world. Nobody's going to compare it to birth. I've had people say, "Oh, you gave birth to a book." I'm like, "No, I have enough women in my life that have described a birth." It may feel like that sort of existentially, but no. It just published in November of this year. It's called "Different Doesn't Mean Broken," and the subtitle is "Living Courageously Outside the Binary." Not the gender binary. I think that the book will teach some people a little bit about what gender nonconformity is, but more than that, it's about creating a life that you love to live and living it authentically, and all the barriers and obstacles to doing that, and how we fall prey to them. And I'm glad I used the word hope because I think my book is a bright shining light of hope for people to be who they are. So different doesn't mean broken. You can go to that website, differentdoesn'tmeanbroken.com. It'll direct you to the page on my website that you can buy it on Amazon. You can listen to it on Audible. You can download it to your Kindle, all those things. As far as working with people, I have a number of different ways that I work with people. Sometimes it's just a spark session over the phone to just chat with them, but they can learn all about all the different ways to get in touch with me. I'm Dawn Mamone everywhere, and I'm sure you can put that in the show notes for spelling, but like DawnMamone.com, Dawn Mamone on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all those places. I put out a lot of content out. I do some videos. I really just want people to understand that they get to be exactly who they are everywhere they go, no matter who they're with. And that freedom brings with it a joy and an ability to live a life that I think most people think isn't possible, when it's not only possible, it's certain.
Mm-hmm. I love this. And you're right. I'm going to put everything in the show notes for people to just, even if you're like, I'm not sure if I want to work with them or what the next steps are, just even connecting and following you. I feel like one of the things that stood out to me from our first few minutes of interacting before we even decided to record was this sense of safety in exploring humility, I think is how I want to phrase it. And I think sometimes that fragility piece can get in the way of a conversation because we're so afraid that we're going to say the wrong thing, do the wrong
Mm-hmm.
thing, not be, I feel like the sort of wokeness culture, like not be woke enough, not be inclusive enough. And it stops people from having conversations or exploring some of their own questions, thoughts, misconceptions. And for me, listeners, the first interaction with Dawn, I felt this sense of safety that I don't have to know all the answers. That's not my job. My job is to be a human that, again, just comes back to I don't know and why. Let's like be curious. And so I feel like just connecting in any way with Dawn is something that for all of you can just invite a bit more of that, because I think that's something we're all lacking a little bit in. And that's really a gift that I feel like you give the world. And so I'm so grateful for you. I'm so grateful that you came on this podcast. I'm so excited to read your book. It is, I know how much work you were putting into it and chatting before it was done. And so I'm excited to be able to learn more about you and kind of get into a different realm of curiosity for myself through your book and that invitation. So thank you so much again. Listeners, check out everything in the show notes. Remember to leave us a comment if there's anything that came up for you, questions that you have, more resources or information you're looking for, your big takeaway. And as always, we will see you back here next Sunday.